and in the UK. We are grateful today to have an extremely distinguished panel. Our speakers today are Professor Abdul Malik Simon. He's a senior professorial fellow at the Urban Institute, University of Sheffield. In addition, he's also a research associate at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. He's a visiting professor at the African Center for Cities in the University of Cape Town, and a research associate with the Rujak Center for Urban Studies in Jakarta, as well as a research fellow at the University of Tarumanagara. He has 3 decade sort of long accomplishments. I will only mention the latest of the 8 or 9 books that he has authored. It is his latest book is titled The Surrounds, Urban Life Within and Beyond Capture. This was published earlier this year. He has also published widely on the issues of spatial composition in extended urban regions, the production of everyday life, for urban majorities in the global south, infrastructural imaginaries, collective affect, global blackness, and the histories of the present for Muslim working classes. Our second speaker is Fiona Anciano. She teaches at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Western Cape. Fiona has done research on democracy and politics, on local governance, urban politics, and comparative democratization. Her latest co-authored article is titled Localizing Governance in the African City, a grounded model of multiple contending forms of security governance. And her latest book is titled Democracy Disconnected, Participation and Governance in a City of the South. Our third speaker is Gautam Bhan. Gautam is an associate dean and a senior lead of academics and research at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements in Bangalore, India. He is an urbanist who works on issues of urban poverty, inequality, social protection, and housing. In addition to the numerous sort of academic publications, he also writes frequently in public intellectual spaces and is also a queer rights activist in India. His latest co-authored book is titled Swept Off the Map, Surviving Eviction and Resettlement in Delhi. And he has also edited the Routledge Companion to Planning in the Global South. And then there are sort of other publications. I encourage the audience to please look at them. Welcome all 3 of you. And to start off, may I request all 3 of you to share some thoughts on our sort of larger theme of citizenship, authoritarianism, and democracy. So Professor Simon, if I could ask you, based on your work in Jakarta and Yangon, how is sort of collective life in the cities changing in the global south?
Both drastically and not at all. I mean, there continues to be really diligent, precise work, concerted efforts to begin to build enduring institutions that enable and broaden the participation of people from different walks of life in terms of designing and governing their living spaces. Certainly in terms of larger social mobilizations. I mean, if you look within your own city in the past years, there's been Shaheen Bagh, there's been the farmers movement. These are all really significant mobilizations. The thing is that this kind of work takes place within what an old comrade of mine labeled some years ago a kind of global civil war, or what I would say is a kind of extended policing operation, and how those kinds of enduring practices of urban institution building intersect within kind of an atmosphere of extensive and diversified policing. And we know the police is a kind of entity that simply exist to survive at all costs. I mean, it has no imagination, it has no ideological vision. And if more and more urban governance is turned over to such policing operations, what is it that it then enables and constitutes? So, I mean, increasingly one finds within many cities the inability of residents who share a space to acknowledge that they occupy the same bus together, that they really are living in incommensurable worlds, and see no grounds of any kind of commonality, even with intense physical proximity. I think we've seen this, most clearly in Brazil over the past year, and in this election cycle. So it seems to me that the tension is that there's a kind of exhaustion of available political vernaculars. There's an exhaustion of all the kinds of symbolic systems through which people could have some kind of anchorage to discover some kind of basis for collective action. And that exhaustion manifests itself in different ways. It manifests itself in a kind of vitriolic pleasure of transgression and rule breaking, and simply a kind of will to power that isn't informed by any particular kind of political vision. It's based on resentment. And then there are mobilizations that are in some ways the insistence upon dignity. I mean, we see in Iran, in the last couple of weeks, it's not a matter of people wanting, I think, for some kind of new political disposition necessarily, but an insistence upon dignity. And so you have a kind of increased indifference to the tropes of citizenship, an indifference to belonging, a kind of cynical relationship with the state, already concluding that national and urban politics simply doesn't mean anything anymore, that life is increasingly within one's own hands, but without the kinds of resources and tools necessary in order to really do something about it. On the other hand, you have certain urban contexts. I mean, I spent the last couple of days in Imbaba in Cairo, this massive district of the poor and the working classes, is the historic center of the contemporary Islamic movement, a district that was in some ways under threat by the reaction to on the part of the counter-revolution in Egypt. But these kinds of districts, in some sense, endure almost no matter what. I mean, life is difficult, but people continue to invest in tending to building social connections, social networks, the way in which institutions such as, the Zawiya, the mosques, always have been, over long periods of history, a kind of platform through which people build a kind of viable collective life, through which their kinds of connections and networks, in some sense, never end. There's no limit to the potential reach that they have. These kinds of the neighborhoods of the masses are in some ways unpoliceable in some ways, even though I see in Mbaba over the last 10 years that they build new police stations everywhere. But in some sense, there is this kind of enduring capacity of very dense, large urban areas of the working classes to continue to try to endure, but where citizenship and belonging and integration are not really on their minds. It's endurance. It's the capacity to continue to reproduce and to extend, to make life a little more livable and imaginative. So in some ways, this notion of civil war that in a sense proceeds through a kind of exhaustion of the familiar political vernaculars will manifest itself in different ways, in different urban contexts. And what will ensue from that, what will be invented from that is not clear. But in some ways is a kind of eruption, a kind of rebellion, a kind of coming into life of something that we don't really know what collective life will look like. But at the same time, day to day, we continue to, with commitment and diligence, try to work with the tools that we have and the understandings that we have to continue to try to build these kinds of viable local urban institutions. But knowing full well that within a context of incredible volatility, uncertainty, and where politics as we know it probably can't be played the way that we are familiar with.
Fiona, Professor Simon is talking about a cynical relationship that people have with the state. You worked on urban governance, and what insights does your work in South Africa reveal on the theme of sort of governance and the kinds of shapes urban governance is taking?
Okay, yeah, thanks. I think that was a really fascinating input, and I agree with much of what you've said. I guess I'm going to just stand back. Let me give a bit of context. So to contextualize my input, I'm from Cape Town, and I work very much on urban governance at the very local level. And I've been working for many years, mostly in informal settlements. That's what we call them in South Africa, but otherwise known as slums or favelas. And I work with student research teams. And we look at questions of citizenship, democratic participation, civil society, etc. And so I wanted to reflect a bit on democracy and democratic practices and democratic innovations from this very local neighborhood level, below even the most basic unit of political representation, below what we might see as a ward or the level at which people will elect a representative. So really thinking about the local neighborhood, and particularly thinking in relation to low-income or vulnerable populations. And so there are two broad points I wanted to make regarding the questions you've posed, and specifically thinking through democracy. And firstly, that is that democracy as a system, I do think may be under threat. And I think there is an exhaustion here with democracy, to use the terms Prof. Simone was using, as a system. There's an exhaustion with the idea of democracy as a system. And indeed, as the Colloquium frames it, we do need to be concerned about the decline of democracy. And I'll reflect on a few reasons as to why I think this is the case in the context, particularly of citizens in informal settlements in South Africa. But I do still think that democracy as an ideal, in terms of the principles and the processes it embodies, are in many contexts actually still thriving at the local level in everyday decision-making. And here I'll share a couple of views on the other side of the Colloquium title, which is, Reinventing Citizenship. But first, why is there this disenchantment with democracy as a system? So it's becoming increasingly clear that citizens are very cynical about the potential of the democratic system. And here specifically, I mean neoliberal democracy as a system to deliver effective representation and to hold potential for meaningful development. And by development, I mean opportunities to build a sustainable livelihood that includes stable income, protected human rights, and this includes the term dignity, and reliable service delivery from local and national government. And I know democracy and development aren't always necessarily linked, but I think in the context in which I work, development becomes very linked to the idea of democracy. So why is there this case? Well, To contextualize again where my research is based and where my thinking is coming from, it's based on work we've done. I've worked with a colleague, Lawrence Piper, over the last 10 years in a suburb called Hout Bay. Now, the suburb is a very interesting place to study because it's got 3 distinct neighborhoods. And one of them is a low-income informal settlement called Imizamo-Yetu. Another settlement in the suburb is called Hungberg, and that's a sort of small fishing village with residents that are termed coloured in South African terms, which is a racial category. And then there is a wealthy white area called the Valley, and that runs right to the middle of Hout Bay and actually takes up most of the land. So we've spent years looking at how these communities engage the state, and we've done this through looking at moments of conflict or crisis. We've mapped multiple crises and multiple conflicts over 10 years and underpinned what drove these and how were they resolved and why were they resolved and how were they resolved and what were the power relations. And one of the key things we found is that time and time again, the conflicts arose because there was a distinct disconnection between formal democratic processes and everyday experiences of governance. In other words, many of the forms of governance that impact on individuals' daily life are not linked in any way to political representatives or even state officials, not linked in any sense that those citizens engaging in these conflicts, engaging in these everyday forms of governance can see how they relate to the democratic system. So for example, in Imizamo-Yetu, the informal settlement, and here I'm going to turn again to policing so we can keep that theme going. Everyday safety and security is managed by patrollers. These are not the police. And the patrollers are a group of people, men, who have a form of vigilante justice. And this doesn't mean you can't see the police, as Prof. Simone was describing in Cairo. The police are very visible. There is a large police station right there on the outskirts as you go into the settlement. But the police are not the first point of call if you have a security issue and you live in Imizamo-Yetu. If your cell phone is stolen, for example, you go to the patrollers. And obviously you have to pay a fee. If you're a woman, you pay about $6. If you're a man, you pay about $12. Men pay more because men are meant to be part of the patrollers. And if you don't actually do the patrolling at night, then you must pay extra for the service. But the patrollers will sort your problem out and the police will sanction this. The police actually are grateful to having the patrollers there because they take away a lot of the burden that they can't meet. But it's not only security. If you need electricity, you call up a local resident with training on how to wire your shack to the main electricity pylon. If your street is dirty, you get in touch with a newly formed community organization. That community organization has recently got donor funding, they get plastic bags, they organize street cleanups. You don't contact the government most of the time. And that's not to say that there aren't government services. They are, but they're patchy, they're hard to monitor. And really, it's very unclear for residents and citizens who they should contact if they've got a problem with any kind of service. But you do know the local actors in your street, and you know the local actors in your block, and you know that they are your first point of contact. You know how to see the patrollers because the patrollers actually took over the local library in Imizamo-Yetu. So it's very clear where you go to. But I just also want to make at this point that it's notable that it's not only low-income citizens that work around or substitute for the state. The wealthy are actually, and we see this in the Valley and Hout Bay, are actually increasingly doing the same. They're moving to off-grid electricity or getting boreholes for water, or hiring their own security guards, or using private health systems, for example. So for all citizens, there was a felt disconnect from formal democratic systems and everyday forms of governance. But this is probably most pronounced in informal settlements. So you can see here, why would citizens be interested in the formal systems of democracy if those distant politicians they elect every few years have very little bearing on the key issues that are actually facing their lives on a daily basis? So that's one key reason I'm concerned with the system of democracy and a disenchantment with it. But a second reason for disaffection with democracy, I think, lies in citizens' understanding of the concept itself. What do people in informal settlements think democracy actually is? And several research studies by colleagues in Johannesburg, for example, have shown that residents in informal settlements equate the idea of democracy to that of freedom. And this is not surprising, given South Africa's apartheid history. But what is enlightening is that most citizens in informal settlements don't feel free. Why? And here we come back to the idea of development, because freedom for them is not freedom from harm, but freedom to secure the material needs and ideally their aspirations. And some of this might be secured through the state delivering on your socioeconomic rights, but some of this is dependent upon your own economic income. So for many, if you can't get a job, you're not free. Democracy was meant to deliver freedom from poverty, and this has not happened. So this is where development is implicitly linked to perceptions of freedom and democracy. So democracy perceived as a system for meeting socioeconomic needs is also floundering. So you can see that there's both disconnected democracy and there's also this process of democracy as freedom not meeting the ideas of what it was meant to hold and symbolize. But based on our research on informal settlements, it is clear, however, while there is disenchantment with democracy, citizens are still engaging in everyday democratic practices. If you spend a few weeks in any informal settlement, you'll see multiple democratic processes on a regular basis. And here I'm talking about looking for key democratic norms that include participation, representation, collective action, civic organization. So as a starting point, if you go into any informal settlement in South Africa and you say, can you show me that I'm a committee? I'd like to meet someone from the committee. Any resident, any citizen, they will know where to point you to, because there will be multiple committees in any informal settlement. There'll probably be several in one block, or maybe there's only one committee for a whole settlement. But these are active, engaged, and contested spaces. They're full of debates, and they're often conduits for engaging with political parties and with branches of the state. But saying this, and I'm going to return to the phrase I think perhaps Simone raised, which is, exhaustion and the idea that there is still a lot of challenges here, because I don't want to idealize these forms of local democratic governance, because rule can at times be violent, or the threat of violence can be employed to gain power in committees. And there can be different forms of exclusion. And I think notably here, xenophobia has played a huge role recently, because this excludes those who are seen as being able to become power holders in committees and those who may not have a voice. But even while accepting these extreme constraints, there's still vibrant spaces. They still meet frequently and they still contest ideas. And I think here it's important to note that certainly in the context I've been doing research, apathy has not won out. And just interestingly, to sort of sum up my comments on this point, that actually what we've been seeing recently is that COVID may have actually had an unintended positive consequence on deepening these democratic practices of committees. So during COVID, another project and a group of students and I decided to try to understand how people were responding in real time during the crisis. And so we launched a series of digital WhatsApp diaries to engage with residents. And some of our residents came from Imazama Yetu. And we've continued to then also do digital diaries more recently with residents there to track before, during, and after COVID experiences. And what we found, one of our findings, is that before COVID, if you were a local leader and you wanted to gather people around, you used to have to use a loudhailer, and there was a lot of control over communication. There was a monopoly there. But because of COVID not being able to leave your house and lockdown, WhatsApp has become the medium of communication. So now there's actually a far more dispersed use of power and a lot more transparency actually in who is able to communicate and what information gets shared, because local leaders can no longer have a stronghold on this information. And so actually these spaces are becoming potentially even more open and more transparent. And power is now potentially even more evenly distributed. So hopefully this is going to be an opportunity now to turn from the idea of a disenchantment with democracy to building on these principles of everyday democratic practices and surfacing them in more terms that we'll be able to engage with the state more effectively. But I'll leave my comments and turn back to this later.
Thank you, Fiona. Gautam, in the period that you've been observing the housing justice question, do you also notice sort of forms of exhaustion and the endurance that Professor Simon was talking about, or Fiona's found sort of spaces of reinvention? What are your sort of thoughts about it?
Yeah, I think I was thinking a lot about the title of this, of our discussion today, because the other word in the title is authoritarianism, right? Which is in one way meant to be a sort of antithesis to the democratic. And at least it's the one thing you're supposed to not want. Even if you're disenchanted with democracy, none of us are enchanted with authoritarianism. I mean, that's certainly a kind of move. So you've a strange kind of multiple choice process of elimination way to think back to the political system you sort of want to live with. But housing justice is an interesting entry point, right? So I'm born and lived all my life in Delhi, and I look very closely at questions of evictions, say of the same informal settlement that Fiona was talking about. And if you think about Delhi, the two large round of large-scale evictions, so very clear empirical moments of injustice. The first happened between 75 and 77, where our constitution was suspended in what we call the emergency, so a non-democratic time period. And the next round happened precisely in the middle of democratic rule over the last 20 years in the city, right? So a lot of work done by folks in housing rights movements have shown that Delhi has done no less than 300 evictions between 1997 and 2020. Right? So if I think about the fact that evictions as a fundamentally unjust, and I'm not saying undemocratic, and I think this is really what I'm trying to get at, but a fundamentally unjust period of action, in my own city's history have happened equally within authoritarianism and within democracy. So one of the things to then think about is, if you think about housing justice, what's pulling this apart? And what is it that, if we are still yearning for democracy, what is it that we're actually trying to grapple for, right? And it makes me think a little bit that perhaps the distinction between the two terms allows us to be more specific about forms of injustice. And maybe what we're trying to get at a little bit is to try and think about whether we can survive, endure, and understand and resist forms of injustice. And I think that the sense that injustice is somehow more attached to authoritarianism than it is to democracy, I think this contemporary inequality has broken in us conceptually, empirically, and I don't mean to draw a simplistic comparison. There are forms of injustice that are very specific to authoritarianism. But the truth is there are forms of injustice that are very specific to democracies. And we don't talk as much about the latter as we talk about the former. And so if I think a little bit about the question of specific forms of injustice, then housing justice, to me, gives me three things that I sort of think about. And if I think about sort of the quality of democracy and its relationship to justice, this is one way to think about it. The first, I think, is one of the ways in which the evictions that happened in the last 20 years in Delhi happened because they came through orders of our judiciary and not our elected government. And so, in Hindi and Urdu, we have this notion that we know how to resist. Citizenship is about the sarkar, right? And the sarkar can be translated either into the state or into the government. And the politics of citizenship and housing has always been the notion that the basti, or the settlement, is not just a housing form, it is precisely a spatialization of citizenship. The fact that you can get in there and endure, to use Malik's word, is not just a question of economic survival or livelihood. The fact that you can endure outside the law is precisely the possibilities of citizenship. It's not glorious, it's not redemptive, it's not ideal, but it's precisely citizenship. You have enough of a claim, you are recognized as enough of a person, you have enough of a sort of a physical bodily claim, a political claim. The sarkar looks at you and says, I'm never going to give you enough rights for you to become a full property-bearing citizen. I'm never going to put you far enough that you leave the city, right? And this negotiation was a negotiation of citizenship. So housing in incrementally built, auto-constructed, settled cities where nothing looks like it's planned and property is not bought, but actually acquired and built and claimed, housing has always been citizenship. It has been time. And it has been much more meaningful a marker of citizenship than the ballot box. And so I think that if I look at the eviction, something says to me that the fact that evictions can happen through democratic processes signals a change in the quality of democracy. The fact that you can no longer endure. And Malik and I have talked about this often. The collective life is odd because it seems endless and eternal and enduring until one day it's not. Because the eviction marks a hard limit of collective life, of that form of endurance. And that endurance was our social contract. Our social contract wasn't some Rousseauian, Greek, Platonic, Athenian, wonderful notion of democratic rights. It was an incremental, fragmented, patchworky agreement saying you push, but you don't push so far. That was the nature of our democratic contract, right? I mean, any reading of Ambedkar will tell you that Indian democracy has always been thin and almost, to use his word, a facade, right, in many kinds of ways. It doesn't make it unreal. It just makes it the nature of our democracy. And so if I think about that, then I think about the fact that when the judiciary orders an eviction, why don't we use the word authoritarian to describe that action? because it's precisely an act of authority. And it's precisely an act of an authority that refuses a certain kind of political accountability. You cannot protest in front of a court. You protest in front of a municipality office. You can't vote out the court. You can't hold the court. You can't shame a court democratically. All of those reasons are also why sometimes we believe the judiciary has the possibility of justice, right? And so it's peculiar. Our faith in the judiciary is almost anti-democratic. We sort of believe in it because we believe it can't be negotiated with. But all the possibilities of our endurance were based on that negotiation. So I think a little bit about maybe the notion of reinventing citizenship is first about pulling apart these easy dichotomies between authoritarianism and democracies, and actually thinking of authority, of Malik's idea of the police, not even as the literal police, but the Rossier idea of the police, right? The police, the police of the police that structure social power and hierarchy. It doesn't need a police force, even in that way. And I think that housing justice is a very good place to see the changing quality of democracy, precisely saying, do you have the possibility of endure? Do you have the permission to endure? Do you have the possibility to even try to endure in our cities in some ways? And when thousands of migrants started leaving Indian cities, walking on highways during COVID, what they were precisely signaling was a limit to endurance, in many kinds of ways. So I have begun to think about the fact that it seems to me that we should be talking about injustice if we want to reinvent citizenship, instead of thinking about the form of state polity, whether it's authoritarian or democratic. And I think that's important because I think it's important to think about what's causing the injustice and be specific about that. And so the second part about it that I think is new for me, that I myself am grappling with, one thing I think where authoritarianism does work well as a concept to understand contemporary urban Indian politics is that the language of injustice in our contemporary times has increasingly taken the form of a kind of majoritarianism. And majoritarianism is a form that authoritarians and democrats equally use. Again, there is nothing specific to majoritarianism or a hyper-nationalism. All the hyper, quote-unquote, right-wing nationalists, as we like to call them, in the world today, almost all of them are elected. Yeah, these are not folks, these are not monarchs and feudal service, these are elected leaders, right? And so when I think about that question, I'm sort of think about and saying, what if, again, our target is majoritarianism instead of the distinction between authoritarianism and democracy? I think what majoritarianism has done to housing is that it has taken, these settlements that Malik is describing, what he called them once majority districts, this idea that I've always really loved. They took these forms that had different symbolic registers, right? They were not just about vulnerability and inadequate infrastructure. They were also about presence and incremental growth. They were these negotiative citizenship. And it has taken this language and replaced it to this single tone. They have sort of, I feel like sometimes it's not just that the discourse is exhausted. I feel the discourse has been overpowered. It has been flattened. It has been sort of violently our ability to speak in tongues is being taken from us. Like we are being told how to speak of neighborhoods. We are being told what they are, that this meaning is being pushed on them. And so therefore the language in which we describe fellow citizens, fellow areas in the city, fellow neighborhoods, the ability to describe them is being flattened. And I think that majoritarianism exhausts collective political vocabulary in a very different way than cynicism. And I think that it's important to think about, in contemporary India today, you feel the weight of majoritarianism. You feel the impossibility of speaking in other languages. And I think that's a very particular form of exhaustion that has something to say about when we think about citizenship. And I think that it has meant that areas that we would call working class neighborhoods, we don't quite get to call them working class neighborhoods anymore because other monikers are being given to us. We are being forced to describe them in other terms. And those terms are literally what will cause that exhaustion of belonging and citizenship, because endurance in collective life also means, if you take Fiona's idea of freedom, the ability to quickly be something else at a different minute when you need to be a committee member in a minute, but to be an anarchist in another, to be a voting citizen in another, and to be a hustler in another, and to be a businessman in another. It requires the multiplicity of language, right? It doesn't require a singular language, even of the kind of cosmopolitan community. That's another kind of exhaustion, right? I mean, I do remember that many folks in the social anthropology side of things in the 2000s were exhausted by the language of community, just like we're right now exhausted by the language of, authoritarianism and majority rule. So languages do exhaust in different ways, but there is something about majoritarianism that is particularly harmful to the ethos and rhythms of everyday urban collective life, because urban collective life requires a multiplicity of language and identity, because belonging, when it becomes too fixed, is as disabling to collective life as belonging when it becomes too ephemeral. And it's this kind of balance that I think has tilted in a lot of our contemporary life. And I think the final thing I'll say then is that what that should provoke us to think about, or at least what it provokes me to think about on days when my energy is a little bit away from that exhaustion, is that I think that being specific about forms of injustice allows you to be specific about forms of resistance. And I think that to take on housing evictions as a question of the changing political economy of land markets in our cities, which certainly has the power to exhaust democratic resistance. There is a certain time in which the price of the land under the informal settlement changes in a way that no form of negotiation and citizenship works. It just stops working. And I think that's definitely so. Is it really about, is the political economy actually the story that underlies both authoritarian and democratic resistance regimes? I think the question of language and ephemerality and belonging and the way to imagine a social in the different way, a collective social in a different way, that's neither community nor alienation and loneliness, I think is another one. To think about the ways in which we are exhausted in different ways, I think is another one. So, and I think that the reason it's important to separate these forms of injustice is because I don't think any of us can fight all of these battles at the same time. And I think that's what a new social or reinvention can look like, is you need people to articulate resistance in different registers, right? Who are thinking about, bridging that gap between the government and the service provision in the state. Because it is absolutely true that if one part of democracy is freedom, that freedom is as much about material dignity as it is about political or social or belonging. One can't only belong and still then not have that water pipe work in the house, right? And I think that the one real question that to me comes is a lot of the reasons why both authoritarians and unequal democrats get away with things is partly because the material consequences of picking a political fight are too great for too many. And in many ways, Edgar Peterson and Malik once defined a southern city as a city where the majority holds vulnerability. And I've always thought it was the best definition of the South that I'd heard, right? That the idea that the majority holds vulnerability. So the question we should ask is, how do Democrats get away with letting the majority be vulnerable? And how do autocrats get away with letting the majority be vulnerable? And I think we'll find that they have many tactics exactly in common, and then some differences. And I think the more specific we can get about that, we can see the relationship between the larger political structures and the everyday life of citizenship.
Thank you, Gautam. But just as a quick sort of follow-up, is your if one were to think sort of further with what you said, and one were to use the category of injustice instead of democracy and authoritarianism, implied in that is also perhaps a persuasion to think in ethical and moral categories, because we are thinking of the question of right and wrong and not the question of right and left. Is that sort of, is that an implication?
I mean, I think if the question one is asking, my sense is that one wants to reinvent citizenship precisely towards an ethical and moral end. Otherwise, it would be a reinvention that would feel very mechanical and transactional. I mean, certainly our reinvention of citizenship can't be about more efficient bureaucratic state practice. So to me, yes, absolutely. I think it is deeply an ethical and moral question. I think it must be an ethical and moral question. At least our motivation must be ethical and moral. But I think what I'm also trying to say is that the ethical and moral are nested between both political economic structures of very real material inequality that cannot be separated from the ethical and moral questions and the social questions. And I think also that systems of political rule create what we are meant to treat as our ethics and morals as citizens. Right? So, I mean, I think different political regimes democracies tell us that we are ethical and moral because we are democratic. And I think it's very important to investigate that claim. And I think that very often democracies have precisely rested for very long on the belief that being democratic is an ethical and morally superior state of being. And I believe that. But I believe that is an ethical and moral question that has to be repeatedly asked and answered. And that the political structure alone or the material foundation alone, neither of them can guarantee the persistence of actually a sort of horizon that one wants. So yeah, no, I think it is absolutely an ethical and moral question for me. And maybe the question to ask is, what allows a fullness of a certain ethical and moral social contract? And is it these questions of political structure? Is it the material foundations? Is it our spatial and urban conditions, or some combination?
Professor Simon, the words you sort of used have been the theme of survival, the theme of endurance, the theme of apathy, the theme of exhaustion. How do the sort of, if one kept in mind the various efforts that residents of various cities in the global south make to construct shelter, to construct and maintain infrastructure, or provide services, or look after or make attempts to sort of access the commons. How do you see these themes speaking to those practices?
I mean, the conundrum that I feel in a for example, within Jakarta, for example, are the way in which working class districts, again, largely auto-constructed through a kind of intricate interweaving of different kinds of alliances, different kinds of resources, different kinds of histories, are increasingly subject to different kinds of policing operations, some of which are eviction, but most often not physical eviction per se, but rather a combination of various assaults on the kind of economic underpinnings of these districts, the ways in which livelihood was created really entailed a kind of thickened net of reciprocities, complementarities. Now residents are increasingly folded into extended versions of a kind of platform economy which individuates their economic activity away from the day-to-day kinds of social negotiations. There is the increased vilification of the poor and the working class as responsible for increasingly precarious environmental conditions. And then under the name of sustainability, you have a kind of extension of the biopolitic of taking care of trying to preserve human life, which necessitates particular kinds of dispositions, which constitute a kind of disjuncture from the kind of familiar practices of livelihood creation. You once had a kind of democratization of debt, whereas people who day to day would go into debt to cover particular kinds of expenses, but there was a sense that such indebtedness was somehow shared through various kinds of exchanges, different kinds of temporalities of obligation, people responding to each other very concretely in terms of that the social reproduction of the household was not individuated in terms of household, but was really a kind of collective responsibility enjoined by many different households. As Gautam was saying, there's sort of this imposition of a certain kind of horizon, that you can only have a life worth living, you can only be effective if you think of your life as a kind of property, as the acquisition of some kind of asset, an asset that has to be acquired and then protected. And in some ways, a policing operation is in some ways steering people into the exigency of the acquisition of that asset. For example, in Jakarta now, you have this situation where the working poor are increasingly pressured into the acquisition of 25, 32 square meter affordable flats, no money down, no down payment. You have 15 different kinds of payment possibilities that are extended over long periods of time. So in some ways, debt is no longer democratized, it's increasingly individuated. And the only thing that puts you in common with your neighbors is in some ways that you all have to pay and pay and pay within a kind of interminable horizon. And you have your asset, but the asset increasingly is not fungible, and the asset puts you in a kind of residential situation where the kinds of complicated social atmospheres of inventing life, of always having the possibility that the future is something that is something. So in some ways, it is this kind of, it is a kind of foreclosure of the future through a kind of the political technologies that increasingly are focused on probability, on deciding whose contribution has what kind of value in relationship to everyone else, a kind of incessant form of calculability. What is my life worth in relationship to yours? All of this in some ways forecloses the possibility of a collective invention of a future. It preempts it in terms of this kind of incessant notion of comparison, individualized asset acquisition. And the way in which one then begins to circumvent that is simply to, in some ways, for people's lives to be distributed across multiple different kinds of territories, people in motion, people not looking for a kind of destination, people not looking to be somehow putting all of their resources in terms of cultivating and developing a place, a particular platform, but how one in some ways sustains multiple platforms across urban regions that are increasingly becoming larger, more heterogeneous in many different ways. And so you find a kind of citizenship through circulation, through the kinds of chance encounters and opportunities that one discovers in motion, in circulation, and in distributing one's households across multiple different sites as a way to have different apertures, different openings onto different kinds of possibilities. Because I think in some ways what takes place across many different cities is the way in which policing operations really are directed very firmly against the social intimacies of particular kinds of districts, particular kinds of social negotiations, the way in which life is produced through the ability to negotiate what is going on, even to determine the facts of the matter. What is really going on? It used to be a product of everyday negotiations. Now it's how you navigate through a complex web of hundreds of WhatsApp messages and rumors and news. And so things are increasingly on the run. And if you're not able to sort of run with them and try to make a life in some ways on the run, then in some ways you're subjected to increasingly carceral forms. And in ways in which the disposition of housing and everyday life for the poor and working class becomes in some ways increasingly carceral. Carceral even in terms of the constant preoccupation with, how does my life count? Am I worthy enough? What do I have to do to make my life count in some kind of viable way?
Speaking of sort of undertaking practices in order to sort of make one's voice count, Fiona, if you could say something about your work in, you refer to defiant citizenship, if you could tell us what that practice is.
Yeah, thanks, Akita. Yeah, I mean, it's so I'm listening to Abdul Malik and thinking about what you're saying, and then relating it to the kind of research we've been doing. And you're talking about citizenship through circulation, and I think that is very valid in many contexts. But one of the places we've been looking at is this fishing village. So going back to my site of, I know it sounds crazy that I've spent 10 years just studying one suburb. That does seem a bit mad, but it is actually very instructive because it allows you to understand through, historical kind of research, different patterns and different influences that have happened, particularly in this microcosm of a space. And so one of these areas called Hungberg, that is this, it was historically a fishing village that was created through the Group Areas Act, where coloured South Africans were not allowed to live where they had been, and they were moved into this area. And what's interesting about this area is almost that this type of citizenship is developed there that we've called a form of defined citizenship, but it's really about a citizenship of place, because this is a group of people. So to give some context, I was sitting in Hout Bay one day interviewing someone about the river or something else, how do you clean a river? And I heard some bombs go off literally 200 meters down the road. And as a researcher, you obviously hop up and say, well, what's going on here? So I went down the road and tried to figure out, and there was a conflict there. And that was initially what struck us, as trying to understand what is this conflict. And it was a group of people from Hungberg who'd been fishers, who had been deprived of fishing quotas from the state. And they were throwing petrol bombs at a tourist bus to get attention from the state, because that is a language of protests, and a language of engagement with the state in South Africa is very much protest like that. And then when I started to understand what was happening in this community, there was a lot more underpinning that, because also there was a long history of other forms of conflict around evictions. This particular community lives on the side of a mountain, and they had put a fire break in to stop people building up. Anyone who built into the fire break was evicted. And this community said, no, we're not moving. And so there was a series of 3-day running protests with the police. So the more I started to understand how are people experiencing their sense of citizenship in Hungberg, the more it became clear that there was a strong sense of defiance going on here, of wanting to be included in the state, but included on their terms. And I think it's actually something quite positive. And maybe I'm counterbalancing here Prof. Simone's negative is the wrong sense. Maybe I'm trying to shed a little bit of light here to say, well, there are glimmers here of how we can see an active form of citizenship. And I think South Africans, to be honest, and maybe I'm drinking the happy juice, but I do think South Africans have a very strong sense of the right to claim rights that comes through in their citizenship action. And it doesn't always manifest, and certainly there are all of the concerns that have been raised, but there is a strong sense of having this right to claim rights. So what do we see when we think about defined citizenship? So this is essentially the idea that it affirms the membership of the state, but on the terms that assert the primacy of residents' rights of belonging in and sovereignty over the place, even against the will of the state. So this form of citizenship is rooted in a long-standing experience of racial, economic, and cultural marginality, deep disappointment with the post-apartheid order, and a strong attachment to local place. So these things are happening all together at the same time. And it reflects a demand for particular rights that separated out from the universalism that we see in insurgent citizenship, from Holston's insurgent citizenship. There is an element of that, but it's not about being included with the state on the state's terms. It's about being included in the state on your own terms. And it marks it as a unique form of activist citizenship as well. And so the rise of defined citizenship, we've explained it being in conjunction with global, national, and local processes. So the integration of residential land in Cape Town into the neoliberal global property market heightened anxieties of displacement for residents in Hamburg. So if you lived in Hamburg and you were moved into this area, it had no value 10 years ago, but suddenly it has value now because it's got a beautiful view of the sea. And you've got a huge tourism infrastructure, you've got growing, neoliberal property prices. Now your land is worth something. Are you going to be displaced again? And that is a threat. So there is now a strong fight for, this is my place. You don't move me off this place. That's the kind of global impact that's had there. But then nationally, the history of apartheid forced those who were designated as colored to move to Hamburg in the 1950s. And post-apartheid, the sense of racial exclusion was reinforced by the belief that they were not Black enough to enjoy support from the state, because that was seen for Black Africans who were then getting benefits from affirmative action and empowerment deals. But they certainly weren't white enough to have been building on the historical legacy of power that came from being white and the capital power that came from being white. So in respect of local processes, the solidarity and connection to place has been built by decades of living together in this, what feels like no man's land of being colored, and reinforced by the ways that local fishing livelihoods were destroyed by national policies. So if you were a fisher in this place, you weren't benefiting from affirmative action, but you also weren't benefiting from having the white historical power, but you were left then with nothing in between. And now the state was taking away your right to a livelihood through the new fishing policies and quotas that they brought in. Again, this became a demand and a set of conflict and a right to say, we want citizenship, we want inclusion, but on our terms with our policies. And then residents, in terms of the local space, have long been frustrated by an unresponsive political system. And so they don't see the state as a legitimate ruler of Hamburg. But what that means doesn't mean that they don't see the state still as being a sovereign entity that they want to be part of and they want to have citizenship over. But they've got no problem with defying the laws of the state and breaking the regulations. So Hamburg, one of the other stories we followed there are poachers. So Hamburg is well known for having residents who poach abalone and rock lobsters and do so openly. I know where the poachers are, anyone can go there. And this is an illegal action, but they're not hiding it. And this again is a form of defined citizenship. We will be citizens in this place in our own terms. And so I think, I wanted to raise this form of citizenship because I think it does show us that, yes, there is this fatigue, there is this deep marginalization and vulnerability of people with a long history, but yet still fighting continuously for the citizenship, not for inclusion on the state's terms, but for inclusion on their own terms.
Thank you, Fiona. Gautam, movements and groups that have been trying to resist mass clearings in India, what is the role or the space that they occupy in the politics around the urban poor?
No, I mean, I agree with Fiona. I think that I don't think there's any question in the continuing struggle to belong and remain. I think the only thing we're trying to grapple with is when the calculus or terms of that struggle seem to shift in particular conjunctures. And I think that's really, and the reason to think about why they're shifting and why they may become heavier or lighter in some ways is only to think about whether those tactics and strategies of defiance then have to sort of be tuned in some way. And I think it is absolutely important to, in different sites, we speak from some different places, think about how precisely to resist certain forms of closure and exhaustion, right? And so I think when housing rights movements were fighting evictions, one of the things in the early 2000s that was very, very difficult was that the set of tactics, the set of negotiations, the set of claims, the language, the right to have rights, which housing rights movements in India and social movements in India have owned very powerfully. Like, these are not diminished actors in any way. That language seemed to run out for a period of time. And part of it was the rise of the judiciary and its new forms of authority. Part of it was a light of new forms of political economy and changing urban development and changing markets. And part of it was precisely this new language of majoritarianism. I think that at this point, what movements are trying to think about is how one shifts and finds language that has resonance in response to these new challenges. And I think that's the challenge, right? And I should say these are movements that I call movements, because let's be very clear, movements that enjoy the language of majoritarian democracy are having precisely the moment perhaps we had a couple of decades ago when we thought we were the democratic, kings and queens of the world. And it was, the Latin American turn to the left. And it was, there have been moments. And so there are many movements who are precisely today enjoying what they believe is the social compact that they want. And I think that that's social, and one has to take that seriously. It's not the social compact I understand as an ethical moral compact, but that is part of citizenship, right? It's very different notions of what a power is and very different notions of what defiance is. And I think that in some ways, in fact, I'm thinking a little bit about, and that's why it's a little bit easier for me to think through the notion of injustice, which is that in systems where inequality is structural, what are the moves available to you, right? And it's never to suggest that there are no moves. It is never to suggest an eraser of agency and power and endurance, but it is to take seriously what one is hearing and feeling, that a certain way of moving. And I'll give you a very simple example. When one of the large-scale evictions happened in Delhi, a whole set of people, myself included, went and tried to sit in a sort of sit-in hunger strike protest at the Delhi Development Authority, which was our urban authority. And they told us that they had nothing to do with the eviction. And they told us that it was a court order that the police implemented. And so the discussion in the movement at that moment was, we should go sit with the same hunger strike relay, etc. protest in front of the Supreme Court. And we couldn't. We couldn't. And I'll be very honest, at that point, I remember that feeling of saying, literally to myself, but can you do this? Can you, the word we use is dharna. Can you do a dharna in front of the court? And I remember very distinctly a very senior activist who had taught me so much of the politics I know. He used this word and he said, court ki toheen ho jayegi. The court will be humiliated. And it was a very strange language from a sort of very powerful actors who had absolutely no problem shutting down the government, but could not imagine doing it to the court. And, we've come a long way since then. Our notion of the judiciary has really shifted. But at that point, we had come across these 20 years of expansive rights-based jurisdiction from our courts post the emergency, very much the way the Constitutional Court in South Africa ruled for much of the late 1990s and early 2000s. And I think so in some ways, I think for me, the question really is not to be despondent, but it is to be specific. I mean, that is, I think the role of investigative scholarship or the role of thought is to say that it is very important at some point to also say, and at least I feel this way, that I am not certain of the language in which one speaks of an ethical and moral direction to democratic practice. I honestly, I'm searching for it. I would love to see it. And I think I was taught and raised politically and intellectually to have that language. And I feel that language that I was taught doesn't quite hold. And so when I am with my own students, I will confess that I'm uncertain often what to say to them about ways to assert, ways to defy, how to bear the cost of defiance. And I will certainly say that when I have students who don't come from dominant caste and religious and gender privilege, I hesitate to think of them being defiant. because the costs of that defiance are not being borne by me. And I think that, but there was a significant political period where they were also able to bear the cost of that defiance. And that calculus seems to be shifting to me somewhere. And it does worry me. So I think it's and I'm usually with you on the happy Jew stand, Fiona. It's really sort of my go-to mode, and Malik will tell you. But I am definitely in a moment where, because I don't think that we can just try harder or fight more. I think we have to fight differently. And I think a different fight requires different language. And I think that language is not yet here. Right? And I think it's important to then think. And so the only way I know how to think about a different language is to first be specific about which language has stopped failing, has stopped working in certain ways. And democracy doesn't quite do that, particularly to me right now, globally at this point. And I took a flight yesterday, and if you look at the airport nonfiction bookshelf, it seems to be 20 different books on how democracy has died, failed, it's like every book seems to be telling us how democracy is dying. I'm not that interested in that either. That's not the, I think, story I'm telling. But I do think it is important for us to say that if citizenship has its relationship with justice and a relationship with endurance, right? So both the kind of high ideal political horizon and the everyday life of collective life, then we need to find material, discursive, and imaginative ways to come back to it in ways that have meaning. And maybe it will take a moment, at least for me, it feels like it's taking a moment where those are not coming readily. So I'm not quite sure, for example, how to claim a love for a place like India, without falling into a majoritarian nationalism trap. I mean, one of the hardest things about majoritarianism is it seems to deny you a language in which you can love the place you're in without being nationalistic in a way that is deeply majoritarian. And I think so. That's what I mean. I think that a lot will generate from this. I think new language will come. I think a lot of the faults of the old language that should have been discarded, like community, will also fall apart in good ways. And I think that's the work to be done, and that's sort of where I am.
So if I'm mindful of the time, and there's so much here that I would like to sort of discuss more and ask you to speak more about, but just picking up the last bit that you said, just thinking through where that language is, and thinking, juxtaposing that with our role as academics, as researchers, as people who observe, study, write, and think. Any sort of, to all three of you, I wanted to ask you, where do you see the newer sort of theoretical frameworks developing that can help us study, say in this case, the sort of the urbanizing processes better? I mean, Professor Simon, if you could go first on.
Well, referring to sort of Gautam's notion of specificity, I think that, I mean, for me, the efficacy of and the inventiveness of popular districts was always the capacity to fail. These were districts that were really able to absorb failure without too much debilitating costs. But over the years, you know, the costs of failure are really high. And when failure costs so high, then, you know, your ability to experiment and to resiliently engage in relationships with others that have no guarantees are going to be limited. So then where's the possibility then to use failure? Well, as urbanization no longer really reflects particular kinds of economic processes, and urbanization increasingly becomes an economic process in and of itself. The production of urbanization, the production of real estate, the production of all of these extended regions with all kinds of disparate spatial products. You know, what's being produced is a large amount of failure. And, you know, there are many things that simply don't work from the get-go. Projects that never attain viable occupancy rates. And cities like Jakarta and Cairo are littered with them. So I think it's really interesting to then sort of think about, well, who is working their way through these kinds of failures. So I have colleagues, you know, like Momen Al-Hosseini in Cairo, Christian Sagin in Manila, Nitin Bhatla, who works in the extended regions of Delhi, and Mia Irawati in Jakarta. They're all looking through what inhabiting or using those failures look like. And how can those failures, the production of that failure, be a kind of platform through which you begin, for example, like in Jakarta, you build, you know, whatever is done, it needs security guards, it needs cleaners, it needs drivers, it needs domestics, it needs low-level technicians, it needs clerks. All of these things that aren't really working become somewhat available infrastructure for strange alliances amongst disparate forms of residency to kind of work their way through each other, not in any great big mobilization, but there are rehearsals in a way in which people are discovering somehow some aperture onto trying to make things happen through this very production of failure. It's not their failure. It's the failure of this kind of expansive production of urbanization as its own end in some ways. Well, that's a very specific kind of site. It's a very specific kind of challenge, where the vocabulary of the city, where the understandings of the city don't really apply. And so these kinds of rehearsals begin to be one particular site of trying to experiment, figure out the ways in which a kind of collective operations can be in some ways recuperated through a very active recuperation of a failed landscape in some ways. So that's just one area through which perhaps some different kinds of ideas might emerge. There are probably many, but I'm just sort of saying, you know, when Gautam talked about we need to engage the specificities of particular kinds of situations to see in some ways what might emerge from them. That may be one particular example.
Gautam, if you can go first. I know that you have to leave in 10 minutes or so. We would have.
Apologies for that. I have a slight cab to airport situation. I'll be very brief. I think two things where I'm looking for maybe it's the occupational hazard. I literally went looking for language to people to read as opposed to situations. The one thing that has helped me a lot is reading a lot of the new theorizing on abolition coming out of the US. So I think that if you think about a moment that seems from the outside to look so much about protest and critique, calls to defund, calls to stop, calls to negate, but to me seems, when you just listen a bit more closely, to be such a call for new experiments in generativity, right? So the call to defund the police is not to say there should be no notion of security. It is to say, how else do you produce safety and security? What new structures in different places produce a notion of the police that is not, like Malik was earlier saying, ideologically barren or bereft or an institution for its own end, right? So what is, and so, Ruth Wilson Gilmore wrote something recently I read about the notion that abolition is not just about absence, but about presence, that it wasn't a negation. It was about building these thriving forms, and maybe building it. When I was hearing Fiona talk about the ANA committees, I was thinking about the legacy of the apartheid era street committees that precisely held some of these roles, right? So it's not like under apartheid, like you were saying, that democratic practice was not thriving precisely in these. And one of Malik and my colleagues, Kelly Gillespie, has precisely looked at what is the contemporary legacy of the street committee of the apartheid era urban form, right? And I think so thinking and listening to abolition has been a real space for new language for me, because I think it talks precisely to the scale of structural inequality that feels familiar to really, and because abolition requires such a radical reimagination in to really take it seriously, right? And I think it's been a very important space of listening for me. And the other thing is something that I read recently by Gail Omvit, an anti-caste historian and scholar in India. And in her book on Seeking Begumpura, about utopian thought among Dalit philosophers and scholars, she has an incredible sense where she talks about how ideas of utopic imagination are about bridging ecstasy and reason. And I thought it was such a wonderful sort of ethic, in a way, to sort of say that the idea of utopic thought is not fantastical escape. One is not trying to kind of look away from the present, right? But it's about saying that initial notion of an ecstatic ideal imagination of a hope needs grounding in notions of reason, and that this idea of thinking about ecstasy and reason together, I think, has been really powerful. And the last language that has been very sort of comforting and sort of like, where I'm sort of trying to look is in queer theorist Jose Munoz, and their book, it's called Queering Utopia. And there's an extraordinary introduction to that book, which, a lot of which talks about cruising and about being in the city as a queer body, about desire as redemptive and democratic in this really fundamental way, right? There are very few things that cut across material inequality like desire, no matter how hard that inequality tries. And I think they had this notion of the horizon, and writing about the horizon not as a refusal of the present, but precisely as a way to get out of, they called it the stultifying hold of an impossible present or an impoverished present. So I think that there is language that talks about reinvention. And I think that language is the place that we sort of start. And I think that's kind of that's where I've been looking to, if that answers the question.
Thank you, Gautam. Yes, Fiona.
Great, thanks. Yeah, the very thought-provoking ideas from both the speakers. So I think, what would I say on this question? I think that there's two levels or two scales to think about this moving forward in our research. And the one I do think is taking a more utopian vision, and that is thinking through longer-term, meaningful, sustainable change. And so here's one example. I've been looking at container-based sanitation in Khayelitsha for the last 2 years. And the short-term solution is give people their own portable flush toilets. That's a solution. The city of Cape Town likes it. It's scaled up. It meets sustainable development goals. That's not meeting the long-term needs of residents in informal settlements. That's what we're calling an illusion. It's an illusion of success. It's not actually meaningful. It's not dignified. So we need to think of utopian. We need to think, I think Indra uses the term hope a lot. We need to, what is the hope? What is the ideal? What are we working towards? And that is a longer term, and that maybe that's the ecstasy and reason. But we also have to understand that we're working now in real time with actual cities and people in governments. And so my more pragmatic hat says, can we do both? Let's also see what's happening now. And so, I'm interested in research that tries to bridge this idea of how does the state actually work? Like, can we spend some time with officials? What do they do every day? I'm fascinated about how you get an item onto a budget in the city of Cape Town. Who puts that? Let's put in sewer systems. Who puts it on the budget? And so if we fundamentally, I think we know too little about that sometimes, because I mean, I certainly am very involved in citizen-centric research. That's what drives me. That's what drives my interest, the questions of social justice. But if we miss the other side of the picture, we're not able to see what can we do in the context that works now, even if we know that this isn't the solution, this isn't the utopia. And so thinking through how these things meet, I know Charlotte Lemansky has the term infrastructural citizenship, and I like that because it really helps you to think about, how do we look at infrastructural citizenship? How do we bring both the citizen and the state together at the same time? So so it kind of the short-termist practical ways of engaging the state, if more effectively embedded in the idea of the ecstasy of the long term. So maybe that's the ecstasy and reason coming from a more pragmatic point of view.
Thank you, Fiona. Let me open it up for questions. I'll give Indrajit and Shavnik the first chance in case either of them have a question, and then go to the participant audience questions. So Indrajit or Shavnik, do either of you want to take it?
I think there is an audience question, which is
okay.
interesting. Do you want to address?
Okay, we could take that first. This is essentially a question on whether newer sort of new identities and assertion of new identities is the space for new citizenship, but I will read it for our panel. This is from John Ensor. He says, this is such a fascinating discussion. I wonder to what extent do the discussants see citizenship as emerging from the interplay of plural forms of recognition, social collective senses of the self, governmental through policies or programs that identify and ascribe particular groups and contested, whether individuals or groups come together in acts of defiance or rejection or assertion of new identities. So it's not to a specific person, so whoever wants to probably take this, Professor Simon or Fiona.
I'm happy to chip in, and then I don't know if Professor Simon wants to. So I think I have to say, I think yes, to a large extent. That okay, so let me go back to also to research. So about 12 of us wrote a book. I edited the book, but it was a book looking at moral economies. And what we were really trying to understand there is, we called it had a very long, cumbersome title that I still laugh because I never remember myself. Anyway, narratives of social justice in the post-colonial state. Essentially, we were trying to understand what do people feel is their moral economy? What is it that they actually, from a very grounded sense of research, are fighting for? What do they want? Rather than an assumption that kind of put down on that. And a lot of what we found in our different cases, and these were across a whole range of countries in the global south, was that their sense of what their demands came from, or what their sense of their own moral economy was often in response to a state policy. And it was often in response to the idea of, say, a social good being constrained. So if I go back to the Hamburg example, for example, fishing, the right to fish, to eat fish, is a social good that's always been prevalent in Hungary. When the state suddenly started to change your access to that social good, it wasn't something that people ever particularly thought about or identified as being part of who they were 50 years ago. It was just what you did. It wasn't a huge part of your political imaginary. It wasn't a part of your political imaginary at all. The moment the state put a policy in that said, no, you don't have the right to a fishing quota unless we give it to you, and they structured that access, that now has become a moral economy that drives that community. It's become a sense of their identity and who they are. And it was always embedded there. But now it's become a political issue. And so that's one way I think of responding to John's question, if that is hopefully what you were thinking about.
Sure.
I would generally agree as well. The thing in Jakarta is that it seems as if the state for most people is a kind of form of entertainment. It's, there's a kind of online, mediated sense of a common participation in making jokes about the state. That anything that the state does is stupid, and it exists, instead of it being there to govern or to impose, it rather is converted into an incessant form of entertainment, of which there is a kind of constant cynical response to. In part because I think particularly the lower middle class, the working classes are saying is that, you know, did we relinquish our unruliness, our rambunctiousness, our irreverence, our ways of dealing with each other to try to get an education, to try to do the right thing, to go along with the rules, to conduct ourselves in a kind of rational, normal way? Did we do all of this only to wind up where we are now, which is oftentimes nowhere? And in the process of trying to be good citizens in terms of the imaginaries imposed, we seem to have in some ways relinquished the kinds of capacities we had to try to put together some kind of an interesting life. And so it's not that a kind of imaginary citizenship is necessarily gone, but I think people are beginning to ask, well, what has this cost us? And is it has it been worth, in a sense, doing the right thing with the promise that somehow we were going to not engage in a kind of endless trajectory of accumulation, but simply a kind of sense of self-satisfaction and somewhat well-being, in order to find ourselves in a kind of increasingly precarious circumstance, and in face of a kind of political game that seems only interested in perpetuating itself.
Yeah, Indrajit and Shavnik, if you have any comments, questions.
Can I go for it, Sagnik? Is that okay? Yeah. No, thank you so much. I think both Malik, Fiona, and Gautam, who couldn't stay, I think it's it's very interesting to sort of think about these questions in relation to something like democracy, which is so typically associated with the political science literature and tends to sort of focus on institutions, executives, political parties. And I think the ways you've sort of got us to think about reinventions of citizenship, and really thinking about questions of justice or dignity or defiance, any of those categories that each one of you used, I thought that was that really enriches, I think, the conversations one can have around renewing democracy. So thank you very much. I did wonder if I may ask, each of you, did you see any examples or any ways in which political parties can actually learn from the neighborhood associations, the everyday endurances, Malik, as you put it, or the defiance that, Fiona, you mentioned? And of course, Gautam is not here. He talked about, utopia and ecstasy and the ways in which they entwine. And I'm sure he'd have some thoughts on, whether political parties can learn the good ones. I mean, the ones that are, supportive of, democracy and not sort of hell-bent towards pushing us towards authoritarianism. But I wondered if there were lessons that political parties were learning, or, higher up politicians were learning from what appear to be very small acts of defiance or tiny sorts of, negotiations, endurances. Or is there really not much of a communication between the different scales from the contexts with which you might be familiar? I'm sorry if it's too broad a question, but it just sort of really got me thinking about, what can be learned from these everyday negotiations and these everyday sort of assertions of citizenship.
I mean, first of all, I think you have to pay attention. I mean, I'm relieved that Lula won in Brazil, but really, I mean, the PT is, is all that they can come up with is, bringing back Lula in his late. Hasn't there been any attention to developing the party to, in some ways, really cultivate a kind of young leadership? I mean, the PT clearly hasn't been paying attention to the kinds of turbulence and different kinds of divergences in terms of how people approach sort of everyday life or organization. I mean, I'm not it's not just incumbent upon that particular political party, but it seems like political parties in many instances just are not really taking the time to look closely to how, everyday life is being concretely governed on a day-to-day level.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, Ingrid. I mean, it springs to mind that our president keeps saying whenever he goes on sort of visits, he keeps saying, oh, I was shocked to see this, whatever it may be, bad sewage or no housing, and everyone's going, really? How are you keeping shocked? So I think in our context, when you were framing that, I was thinking, actually, I think it's the relationship's been inverted. I think the political parties in South Africa, well, certainly the ANC, was pretty good, historically in its origin, at learning from and understanding the voices of those active citizens, of the street committees, etc. And now I think they're pretty good at figuring out how to manipulate effectively what's being asked for, and to do a demonstration of another illusion of meeting a need, but it's an illusion. It's a brief kind of tokenistic act. But in my view, they're running out of road. I do think the ANC are running out of road in South Africa. They can't keep playing these games because people are now seeing through it. And well, at least I'm optimistic that there is more transparency happening, and that's, yeah. Anyway, but I think it's a good point.
Shalmik, did you have a question?
Yeah, sure. I just had a very short question for Professor Simon, and I really appreciated your discussion, your insights, and I've just been an avid admirer of your work. So if I could quickly ask you about some of your initial comments that you made. You spoke of how these citizenship mobilizations to occupy space, they're happening. They're not necessarily framed in the language of citizenship. They're also kind of happening as a result of a certain kind of exhaustion. And you invoked the idea of the civil war in those comments. If you could kind of elaborate a little bit on that conception of the civil war and how you see it. And also, I was wondering from the discussion today, if the idea of the state itself is undergoing some very fundamental transformation in relation to democracy in these moments of mobilization. So thank you. Thank you so much again for all your contributions.
No, I mean, it's fun. I think fundamentally has something to do with what does locality mean? How is it, how do we come to this situation where contiguous territories, people right next to each other, can be subject to such divergent forms of local rule or such divergent understandings of where they are in the world and what is required of them, who basically share very much almost the same territory. So what is the local mean in terms of this? And what worries me about this is that this becomes a kind of simulation of the plantation, where the plantation was a particular kind of localization, an impossible localization, where the sharing of that space was so subject to violence and an unsettling of any kind of coherent way of thinking on the part of all those involved. And so that locality, the notion of touch and the notion of intimacy and the notion of people being connected wasn't inherent in sort of sharing in some ways the same space. And in some ways that this gets replicated in some ways within the heart of particular kinds of urban contexts. So then what can be imagined as the kind of suture, as the kind of connection? Because, I mean, just because, I mean, on the other hand, just because people are next to each other doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be in a relationship with each other. That's never necessarily been the case. But there's something that in some ways makes then governance, urban governance, as some kind of viable political technology increasingly difficult, because if you're having to try to rule or to govern such radically divergent kinds of spaces, well then how is that possible? And maybe it won't be possible. Maybe there is going to be much more translocal, transversal forms of belonging and governance that no longer are brought under the rubric of localized territories as we understand it, and that we have to understand localization in a completely different kind of way.
Thank you. With that, we will bring the discussion to a close. Thank you to, sincere thanks to both our panelists who have stayed on for this long, and particularly Fiona. If it was midnight when we started, it must perhaps be wee hours of the night now. And also thanks to Gautam, who had to leave a little bit early, but we're very grateful for the time that you all gave, and this gives us lots to ponder about, to think about, and to take back. And for our audience and attendees, I'd just like to quickly tell you that our next session is on the 18th of November, same time. And we have in that session Ghazala Wahab, Rafael Suzwin, and Kutsia Contractor. So please do watch out for the registration links for our next session, and we'll be very happy if you are able to attend our next session. Thank you, Professor Simon. Thank you, Fiona, and thank you to Mel and to sort of everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Ankita. Take care. All the best, everyone. Yeah, have a good weekend now.
Thanks, Malik. Thanks, Fiona. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Nika.
Thanks,
Bye.
our audience members. Bye.